So you know that object-oriented programming is all about programming in a language where everything is an object. Object, just a super generic name for anything at all. All objects can have attributes, that's like their properties, and methods, that is things they can do, their functions. And the point of object-oriented programming is that you can define new objects, which can be helpful and specialized for a particular task. And the way that you define new types of objects in most object-oriented programming languages is by defining a class. A class is a template for a particular data type. So let's say I'm programming a game and I have potentially many users in that game, many players. And each of those players, they're going to have the same attributes. They're each going to have names and usernames and experience and that kind of thing. And they're also going to have the same functions. They're going to have the same things they can do, the same methods, we call them. And the attributes and the functions, which any player can have, they're going to be the same for all players. So what you really want is a template of here's how a user should behave. And so the class is that template. A class is a blueprint for a particular object. So here's how I program it. Firstly, use the keyword class to say that I'm trying to define a class. This is much like the def keyword in Python, where def is followed by a function name, class is followed by a class name. So I'm going to make this a player class. Then I'm going to put a colon to indicate that I'm going to the next line. I'm going inside the class now. So now I'm writing the body of the class. And inside here, the main thing that you'll see is different functions defined. Now these functions, they belong to the class, to this particular template. So if I have a class which says hello, and it just prints hello, then this is one of the things which any particular instance of my player blueprint, they're going to be able to do this. They're going to be able to run their hello function. And the way that you use a class, it's probably the simplest class you could ever create. The way that you use a class is something like this. So I'm going to have player1, and that's going to be an instance of this class, like that. Put the round brackets after the name of the class to create an instance of that class from the template up here. And now, once I've got that instance of the class, I can access its attributes and its methods, its properties and its things it can do. In this case, all it has is one function, one method, that's one thing it can do. And so the way that I access the method is using the dot operator. Like that. That's how I access that function. And that's a function which I've defined, so I can call it like that. Now if I run this code, I get an error. And this is one of the confusing things which people often get tripped up by. So because you can have not just one instance of that template, you can have loads. Now I can have player 2, I can have hundreds of players which are following this same template. Because you can have lots of them, when you call a method of a class, it needs to know which instance of that class it's referring to. So let's take this a little bit further and say, hello, my name is name. So every player is going to have a different name, but you don't want to pass this in as a argument here, because then you'd have to, every time you want to use the hello method, you'd have to look at player 1, look at what their name is, and then put it in there. And if I wanted to call that function many times, I'd have to pass in this parameter every time. And I don't want to have to do that. Instead, I should probably pass in the name just once when I initialize this class, when I create a new player. And then I could use that attribute of the player, their name, I could use that in any of the different methods. It's really an attribute which is tied to the player. It shouldn't be passed in as a parameter, because anytime that function is going to be called, it should be the same. And maybe you don't want to have to pass it in every time to every different function. You might have different functions which also need it. You want to have the attribute of the class shared across the different class functions. So how do we get this name inside the player as soon as we initialize it? As soon as we create that instance? The way you do that is like this. So instead of having that name in the method here where I'm going to use it, I can pass it in here when I create that instance of the class from that template, from that player class. I can pass in the name during the initialization. So we call this here round brackets following the name of a class. That's initialization. Even if it doesn't take any parameters, even if it's just like that, that's me initializing this class. I'm creating a new player. Creating a new instance of a player is the proper way to say it. So this is an instance of the player. This is the player class. And putting round brackets after the player class returns you a new instance of that class. This instance, it can access all the different methods which are defined inside the class, as well as the different attributes that each of these players might have. Now I haven't defined any attributes yet, so that's what I'm going to do next. So if I run this cell now, I'll get a different error. It says player takes no arguments. It's happening on this line here when I tried to initialize the player. That's because I haven't defined how it should take in this parameter, really how it should be initialized. And so there is a special function name which you need to define inside any class that you want to initialize in any non-default way. So when I create a player, I know that I need to pass in the name. So the function which you need to write to define the behavior for creating a new instance of this class is in a function called init with a double underscore on either side. It's short for initialize, and we call this the initializer or the init method. So when I put round brackets after a class name, I'm calling the initializer, basically. We'll get to that in more detail as it goes on. But for now, just know that anything that needs to be done during the setup, creating a new instance from that template, should be done in the initializer. And this is where you can pass in things like the name. So to do that, you need to define that they come in to this function here. So one parameter is going to be the name. But if I run this, I'm going to get another error now. I get this error. It says init takes one positional arguments, but two are given. Now this is the place where people might have a hard time understanding this. So I'll try and explain it as simply as possible. But when I call this function, I've passed in one parameter. Python says I've got two. Now the reason why it's been provided with two arguments is because under the hood, Python gives it another one. Python gives it a first positional argument here. And we call that self. We call it self because this, passed in by Python under the hood, is just a reference to which instance of the class we're talking about. So when I initialize or call any method of a player class, the first argument to that method is always going to be self. So when I run this initializer, behind the scenes, Python takes this instance and passes it in the first position. So that means that you can do something like this. Now this might look confusing, but what I'm doing here is I'm taking this instance of the class, that's player1, getting its name attribute, and then setting it equal to name, which is passed in just after self. Because self was passed in under the hood, this is the parameter we gave here. So if I run this, you'll see that now it's only hello, which is missing one positional argument name. And that's because it doesn't need this anymore. But it does take in self. Every method of class takes in self. And so this name now is not a variable which is passed into this method. It's instead an attribute of this instance of the class, which is passed into every function. So every function can get access to self. And that means that this name is self.name. If I run this now, and I remove this, then everything's going to work. So let's run back over what's happening there. This is a very simple class definition. It's got two methods defined. It's got the initializer, which runs everything that needs to happen when I set up a new instance of the class. And it's got the hello method, which just prints hello, my name is self.name. This is how you call the initializer. Really, this method defines the behavior for round brackets following a class name. And you can access any of the methods of a class using the dot operator. And you can access any of the attributes in the same way as well. any method of a class is going to actually receive one more parameter than you pass it. So here I passed the initializer one parameter, and here I passed hello no parameters. Initializer got 2 parameters and hello got 1. It's because under the hood, Python is always passing in a particular instance of the class, which you can then use inside. So this template is the same for all players, but which instance it's talking about, they might have different names. So to set the name or print the name correctly, Python needs to be able to see which instance of a class am I talking about, which is why it passes in that instance as the first parameter to every method of a class. And now that we've got that template defined, we could create many different players. And they'll all work in the same way. They'll all use the same template, which defines their behavior and sets their attributes. But every time you use one of those functions, the function is going to receive in the first position a reference to a different instance of that class. So when I call player1.hello, self is going to be this instance of the class. When I call player2.hello, self is going to be this instance of the class. And this instance of the class is going to have different values for their attributes, and they're going to be able to be used throughout any of the methods. If you remember nothing else from this video, the key thing is whenever you see self, just say this instance of the class. So here, I'm defining the initializer, and it takes as a first positional argument this instance of the class. On this line, I'm saying this instance of the class's name attribute, set it equal to name. On this line, I'm saying find a function called hello, which takes one thing in, which is this instance of the class. And on this line, I've got a print which prints out hello, my name is this instance of the class's name attribute. And that I find is so useful. Anytime you see self, just say this instance of the class. The final thing I'll mention is that self isn't a special keyword, it's just a convention. So you can actually name this whatever you want. And that's going to be the name of this instance of the class. But please don't do that. Please just call it self. Self is a convention. Everybody knows what you mean when you talk about self. And so that's what you should stick with. Don't try and be fancy with it. Keep the first positional arguments of all methods in classes as self.